Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be starting our second to last session on this most exciting meeting. And I'm Bartha Knoppers. I chair the Regulatory Ethics Workstream. And it's my pleasure to chair this session on governing and using health data. Everywhere you saw the word regulatory this morning and all those legal issues and things. And we're going to have three presentations in sequence, followed by 15 minutes of discussion. So hold on to your questions. It's a privilege to introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Stoddart. Not only does she come from McGill, yay, but she actually was the Privacy Commissioner of Canada for a decade, and I think probably in the history of the Privacy Commission of Canada, they've never seen such a phenomenon in terms of her expertise and her courage in that role. She's a member of the board of the International Association of Privacy Professionals. She's also a member of the board of Genome Quebec, and she co-chaired an OECD committee on healthcare governance, which we'll talk about. She's an advocate emeritus of the Quebec Bar and an officer of the Order of Canada. So it's my pleasure to welcome Jennifer to speak to us about health data governance.
Hello, bonjour. Thank you very much, Bartha, and thank you all for inviting me to present in your program. And I hope I'm starting in the afternoon off after we've heard so much about the barriers to data sharing with some good news. And of course, we've heard and you know that the silo approach to data protection is not entirely defunct. Some argue that this is still reflected in the GDPR. This was a concern from the OECD. You all know about the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, made up of 30 countries, trying to improve the living standards of their members. And so, over the years, the OECD documented the various barriers to data sharing and decided to do something about it. The OECD had good building blocks. The OECD was the first international organization to create guidelines on data flows back in 1981. This preceded the European Directive and other similar initiatives. More recently, it's brought it up to date, and the OECD then made its own series of studies on health data governance, starting at about 2011. And so it found that there were many drivers of data use. None of this is new to you. I draw your attention to the new therapies and better research as an important reason for making maximum use of health data. This is another OECD slide. Most of these slides are the OECD's own slides made internally because I thought they would show you a little more effectively just how practical the OECD means to be in encouraging data linkage and better data governance. This is what I call the Inspector Murdoch chart. Inspector Murdoch, you might know him. He's a detective in early 20th century Toronto, about 1905. He has a girlfriend who's a doctor, and a lot of their discussions take place in the morgue. He also has some cases involving people in what was then called the insane asylum. So you see that between then and now, the areas where we have a lot of data are the traditional areas, and the areas which are of great concern today, such as diabetes, we have very little data use and linkage. These are some of the OECD studies on which it based its work. And so the OECD came to the realization, not alone in it, that data was essential for the economic progress of its countries and their populations. So by 2014, this problem of the lack of data sharing became urgent, and an approach was developed to try and reconcile the privacy and security guidelines of 1981 as they had developed and the need to share health data more widely. So a working group was set up, most unusual for a large organization. It crossed two sectors. One sector was privacy and security, the other sector was health, and you can see who was on it, some of the usual suspects, Dr. Bartha Knoppers, Dr. Mark Taylor, and I underlined David Smith, who was the Assistant Commissioner at the time of the Information Commissioner's Office of the UK, which is regarded as the world's premier regulatory authority. I'm excluding the Federal Trade Commission because it's a consumer protection office. So 3 years of work, all the OECD health ministers signed on to a recommendation on health data governance just at the beginning of this year. Two important messages in this recommendation. First of all OECD countries need a national health data governance framework. They have to think about this in an overall holistic, rational approach, not keep going along with a law here and a law there and some regulations and practices and so on that in fact impede data sharing. And secondly, they have to look beyond their own borders and adopt frameworks that harmonize with those of other countries. One of the interesting things about the OECD is, unlike some of our own national legislators, they don't just pass resolutions or guidelines and then leave it there. They actually work with their member countries to see that these are implemented. They develop kits, tools, try and help countries to actually put these into practice for the betterment of their citizens. So this is a list of measures, the 12 measures that are key to developing a health data framework. We'll come back. And they spell out the important mechanisms, and they put up front there's benefits, but there are also risks. These are some of the indicators that need to be monitored because from their previous studies, the OECD realized just how much resistance there is to data linkage and data sharing for various reasons. And so they really have gone out of their way, I think, in terms of this initiative to give countries the tools, the approaches, here the indicators, so that the excuses that were extant up till now can no longer hold sway. They point out the many health data success stories. Because we're in the US, I'll point out that the US is seen as a success story because it follows up on medical technology post-market. The UK, of course, is seen as a leader in research and innovation with its biobank. And here you see all the OECD countries lined up in terms of who shares and makes data accessible. The UK seems to be the overall leader, and the rest of us trail somewhere behind. Again, each country of the OECD can find itself on this chart. How ready are you to use the rich trove of data in electronic health records? Some are very far behind. And again, the building blocks for countries for implementation and monitoring, you can see the OECD encourages countries to be practical, to be open, to share with NGOs on their territory, and of course, they have to monitor what they do and they have to report back to the OECD. So for each of the 12 elements for national health data governance frameworks, the OECD has gone out of its way to highlight the success stories. I hope you can see them. They're in blue, different countries. Again, the UK seems to come up the most frequently. The UK is a unitary country, so compared to some of us federated countries, things are slightly more easy, I would say, but nevertheless, they have been really world leaders in this area. You can see that the USA, again, because we're here, I think it's interesting, is cited out as a leading example of how to train in privacy and security. So any country can just, through this, look to another country, see what they're doing in that particular component of a health governance framework, and borrow from it. So nobody really has to reinvent the wheel in this area. This is what the recommendation formally looks like. This is an extract. Nobody's really interested in this except a few lawyers, so I've just highlighted two of the most important things. The paragraphs that deal with the recommendation for setting up a health data governance framework and the need for coordination within the country, both in the public and in the private sector. This is hugely important because we have a range of countries in the OECD. Nobody's healthcare system is held up for comparison to another overall. We know that we have to work with other public partners within a country, with private partners, more so in some countries than the other, but that they are all players in a health data governance framework. Second part that I would draw to your attention is the recommendation for international sharing and harmonization of frameworks. This is potentially revolutionary, as historically each health system has grown on its own within the context of its own culture, its own laws, it's the importance of its own various professions. And we're going a step further now. We're saying as you build up your health data governance framework, the rules that are part of it, the way it functions and so on, look across your borders. See how people in your country can benefit from the exchange of data among OECD members, but potentially across the globe. And so once again, the OECD is spelling out for its member countries what they have to do step by step in order to move towards harmonizing frameworks internationally. And again, it gives some examples. So here we see another illustration of the practical way in which the OECD works. You'll see by now that all our countries, probably most people here, belong to a country that is a member of the OECD. We will have sent back their questionnaires. The OECD functions on questionnaires. You're always answering a questionnaire when you deal with the OECD. In January, they will they've just got the feedback on the implementation guide that they're working on, and it's in January they're going to send out another questionnaire. And as you go down this list, every 6 months, you will see there is a clear action, and the timetables are usually, and I've been working with the OECD since 2006, they're usually adhered to. It's very rare that the OECD accumulates big delays in its work. So you can expect to see this happen, and the end point is 2022, when it will go to the decisional instances of the OECD, and probably at that point, either the work will be continued or new variations of this work, given its importance, will emerge. So to conclude, I think, of course, I'm biased, having been involved in it, I admit, but I think that this is a major policy instrument. I think that you can use it in the Global Alliance within your own countries to say, well, look, our delegate to the OECD signed on to this. Our health minister was one of the ministers that agreed to this framework, this recommendation. And so what are we doing in moving forward to try and implement it? You can also look at the various toolkits and guides that the OECD has developed to point them out as reference helpers, aids, within your national governments to move forward and to abandon some of the often very loved but very now outdated approaches to data governance. So this will move, of course, unevenly, but I think it is an authoritative document given the OECD's importance in terms of economic policy, social policy generally, and the research that bolsters this particular initiative. So thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our next speaker is Professor David Townend. He's Professor of Health and Life Sciences and Jurisprudence at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. I was given a little bio, and I have to read it. I'm sorry, Dave, because it's so interesting. His theoretical work in legal philosophy focuses on the relationship between law, ethics, and manners. He is particularly interested in the formal politeness of the late 17th and early 18th century Britain and its potential for modern governance. Wow, that's interesting. His practical social legal work focuses around the governance of personal data and health and mechanisms of ethics review in the life sciences, and he chairs the ethics review equivalence task team of the regulatory ethics workstream and the data protection task force as well. So welcome, David. He's going to be talking to us about the potential for an international code of conduct on health data.
Thank you, Bartha. Thank you, Bartha. Thank you for the invitation to come and talk. The stuff on politeness is entirely theoretical, I can assure you. Right, I want to carry on from where Jennifer was talking about the nature of and the use of data protection here, and I'm going to try and make an argument that the GDPR is something that we should be really hopeful about. A message of hope from lawyers. Gosh, that's something. So we know that data protection is an international legal safeguard for privacy in personal data sharing. It's the one we're going to use. It's been in the canon since the late 1970s. We've been thinking about this. There's a sort of common conceptual framework emerging. What I'm talking here is about law. It's not about a common framework in ethics. The Ethics Review Equivalency Board, hopefully one day we'll be able to come and have a positive message from the ethics group as well. But today is a positive message about data protection because I think the interpretation of data protection law can become a facilitator for our research, not a barrier. And the General Data Protection Regulation from 2016 is a real opportunity for that. It's a regulation, so it has direct effect in the member states, all 28 EU member states' law. And you can see from the text that it has a lot of understanding of processing for health research. Pulled out of the fire at the last minute, you might say, but it's there. So it's often in the recitals, it's often in the explanatory note of the text, more than it is in the articles or the rule. So that's a bit of a problem. And there's an enormous amount of reliance left on supervisory authorities and some conceptual discretion left in the text. So really, we have to ensure that the interpretation of the regulation realizes the opportunities available in that regulation for us by connecting it to scientific practice, to global standards, and to public perceptions, which is really where we as the Alliance, the Global Alliance, come into our own with this, because we have a lot of that stuff on hand to contribute. How can we actually achieve this? Well, within the regulation, under Article 40, there is an opportunity to create, effectively, sectoral codes of conduct that would go to the Data Protection Board and then end up being approved by the European Commission. So, essentially, secondary legislation, if you like, of how to interpret the regulation, which is a massive opportunity. And the BBMRI, which is the Biobanking and Biomolecular Resources Research Infrastructure, and the BBMRI ERIC with the European Research Infrastructure Consortium element. So an EU-funded project is taking the lead in drafting a code for that data-intensive, data-sharing work in health research. And I'm very pleased to say that we have some seats already at that table. So we're involved in the drafting stage and in the commentary stage. So this could be the opportunity to actually make data protection work for data sharing. And that's the first message. Data protection law can be a global regulatory regime because it's already there in place that facilitates data sharing and data-intensive research, and the GDPR could be the opportunity to move closer to that sort of idealistic standard. Well, I thought it'd be more, the more excitement generated by that one. Whoa, yes, there we are. So let's go to the structure, because it would be good to see just how we're going to put that. Yeah, you're right to be skeptical. How are we going to pull this out of the hat? Well, I like to make this little temple thing that shows the loveliness of data protection. Basically, at the bottom, we've got the fundamental data protection principles. Things like the security of data, processing for defined purposes, appropriate data for the purpose. So we've got a number of principles. And then onto that, we have the first pillar of data protection, which is you have to have a route to lawful processing, which might be informed consent, or it might be the interests of the data controller, or so long as they don't interfere with the fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subject, or it might be the public interest. So there's a range of routes to lawful processing. Alongside that, the second pillar is the notification provisions. Because essentially, in order to be able to operate any of their rights, the data subject needs to know that processing is going on. Now, that doesn't mean it necessarily means informed consent. What it means is you have to be able to tell them. Okay. And at the top of the lovely temple is the data subject's rights, the right to know what data is there, the right to know what processing is going on, perhaps the right to withdraw. It's interesting that a number of those rights are sort of tempered if it's research. So it's not necessarily a problem. And they're appropriate rights. The sorts of rights that we want to see in the conversations that we've been having in the Alliance meeting already. So what are some of the issues? Well, let's talk through some of them. Informed consent. This is about facilitating foreseen data-intensive data sharing health research from the initial setup. Now, the foreseen stuff is the stuff we know we're going to be doing. Of course, the question is how broad or specific does the consent need to be? Because if it's very narrow, that can cause us all sorts of problems. This is one of those moments where the article, the rule, if you like, sets things up in quite a narrow way, whereas the recital allows, in the case of health, for a broad consent. So that's one of the points we've got to get right in the Code of Conduct. Another one that's emerging, and we're beginning to hear a lot, is how long does a consent last for? And this idea of refreshing consent, which is perhaps more problematic for us. But we have to address it, and we have to make a robust argument for why health processing might be a little different. The next one is what happens about secondary processing of data. Now, this is for unforeseen secondary processing. That's the stuff you've not set the whole project up for in the beginning. For unforeseen secondary processing, does the first consent cover that secondary processing? In other words, is it compatible, a compatible purpose with the original purpose? Now, the articles, as they were in the previous law, the Data Protection Directive of '95, the articles are somewhat unclear, which is unfortunate. But at the last minute, the recitals produce a rather more positive spin, because it says processing for compatible purposes is allowed, and applied health research, not just theoretical health research, but applied health research, is presumed compatible. Now, that's a real way forward for us, I think. If we can get that into the Code of Conduct and understood in practice, this could make data sharing a real possibility through data protection. If that compatibility is exhausted, is reconsenting people for unforeseen secondary processing the only alternative? And if so, under what conditions? That's a real problem for us, isn't it? Because do we really have to go back to the whole cohort and get everybody to sign up again? Because that's very difficult. I think our first part is accepting that when we're signing people up or when we're looking for routes to lawful processing, there's not just one route for each purpose, that there's lots of routes going on. And then arguing that instead of changing horses, perhaps from informed consent to public interest or whatever, we are simply shifting the emphasis on the routes to lawful processing that were gathered, that were used to process the data in the first part. So using some of the other routes to lawful processing for unforeseen secondary processing of already gathered data, for example, the public interest. So there's a way forward that might not mean reconsenting. The next problem is one about identifiability. How should we treat data that are taken from a data set of identifiable personal data that remains as identifiable personal data, but then we've stripped out the identifiers and passed it to another researcher or somebody else? And that's quite a common practice, isn't it, amongst us? But it's seen as a little problematic in data protection circles. So we have an identifiable personal data and set and non-identifying data drawn out of it into a research set, if you like. But of course, the problem is that if you can go backwards and you can actually identify people because the coding still, the identification still remains. So what's an effective firewall? Are there ways of actually protecting this so that even though the identifiable personal data set exists, you can use this model? Well, there's some question as to whether that is actually possible within data protection circles, but the regulation requires that it's the reasonable likelihood of re-identification that comes into play. We have to get a solid, robust definition of that that's a realistic definition. Of course, the problem there is that that's working, if you like, within a contained data set. What about linkages to external data sets? And we've heard to effect re-identification. Again, reasonable likelihood needs to be identified carefully here. Other elements that we can be quite excited about are impact assessments. Yeah, I know that doesn't sound right at all, does it? But data controllers under the GDPR will have to make impact assessments about their work that have to have systematic and extensive review, including an evaluation of the level of risk, safeguards that will be implemented, and, where appropriate, data subject opinion on the purpose of the proposed processing. And this really goes towards data protection by design. Now, I think the second message we can see is that the GDPR's discretions and opportunities can be interpreted to facilitate data sharing and data-intensive research methods. I think we will be able to get there if we can do this right. And we'll be able to fuel a dialogue about the underpinning ethics, because a harmonization of data protection principles will encourage that sort of discussion about, well, why can't we harmonize the ethics as well? And as we heard on the video right at the beginning of the day, they need us to get this right. The third message and the last slide is this. The Global Alliance standards and experience have the real detail and evidence that to contribute to these discussions, this interpretation, this code of conduct. Because we're into defining and providing the required safeguards, the ones relating to security and technical standards. We're also able to clarify benefits and harms, to help legislators, to help regulators to actually understand what's going on, what's at stake, both in terms of what we can achieve and where the risks lie. What does protecting fundamental rights and freedoms, especially privacy, actually mean in practice? We can show from the researcher experience and attitudes, and we can also show the public attitudes. And Anna's going to be talking to this next. And I think this next piece of work is even more exciting than the data protection stuff, which I'm pretty excited about, as you can tell. And the other thing that I really like about this is that this isn't just for the EU. Because if we can contribute to this discussion about the GDPR, it becomes part of a discussion about data protection globally. And of course, the GDPR, if it's going to make any sense, has to key into the international debate, the global debate. We can't just have the EU sitting there on its own with its own sort of rules that are completely outside the rest of the discussion. So it's very important, as much as you can, and I know you will do now because you're so excited about it, to join in with this debate, to share experiences about what it's like to be researching in the area, how exciting the results might be, how frustrating the barriers can be, but where the goals are and how we're going to be able to help. Thanks very much for listening.
That beautiful voice, you might have guessed he left something out of his bio. He's also a singer, by the way. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Anna Middleton, who's Head of Society and Ethics Research at the Wellcome Genome Campus in Cambridge, UK. She has a dual training, both as a practicing genetic counselor and as a social scientist. Currently, she is chair or vice chair of the Association of Genetic Nurses and Counselors, and you're going to see some very exciting work. But I wanted to read off a list of her Your DNA, Your Say, which you see on your program, of the number of languages that this is actually translated into already and being translated into in the future. Currently, English, Russian, Portuguese, Polish, German, French, Arabic. The following languages on the way: Japanese, Mandarin, Swedish, Icelandic, Urdu, Italian, Zulu, and Spanish. I mean, that is truly international, so it's a pleasure to welcome you, Anna.
Good afternoon. So what do the broader public think about their DNA, their medical information bouncing around the internet, being used in the research sharing endeavour? Well, we don't know until we actually ask them. So on behalf of the Participant Values Task Team, I'm going to be sharing with you details of this international survey that we've been conducting to actually ask the public, what do you know about this field? What do you think about what's happening? What are your expectations? Now, this is actually a challenge when we know from empirical data that the vast majority of the public have not actually even heard of the word genomics. So in a recent survey we did in the UK, we asked the British public, have you heard of the word genomics? And 82% said no, no clue. People have heard of the word DNA, and they often think that's to do with crime scenes and identifying bodies. But in terms of the whole genomic data sharing endeavour, the broader public are largely unaware of what this is all about. So if you want to actually ask their views and opinions, you have to get creative in how you engage them. So we have used a series of films to bring people up to speed really quickly with the issues in a non-threatening, easy to understand way to basically explain what all of this is about, to give people the background information to then be able to answer questions about this. So I wanted to share with you, this is what the survey looks like, and share with you one of the films that we have in the survey that basically explains what genomic data sharing is about. Oops, go back.
DNA and medical information sit in databases. It's used to answer questions about health and disease. Hi, I'm a medical doctor. I'm a scientist, and I represent a pharmaceutical company. Any of us may need to access the DNA and medical information in the database. But none of us know who the information belongs to because all names have been removed. As you can see, some contain the information we need. It's like collecting pieces of a jigsaw. And some we cannot open because we do not have the right key from the gatekeeper. Would you like to see a readout of your DNA information? Databases are accessed via the web. DNA and medical information are accessed every second.
Okay, so these films have actually received recognition in their own right and have been selected for showing at 5 different film festivals around the world in the UK, USA and in Norway. So it shows that they have the ability to talk and speak to a mainstream audience. Okay, so this is what the landing page of the survey looks like at the moment. So we're currently recruiting in German, English, Polish, Portuguese and Russian. And as Bartha mentioned, we've got Japanese, Arabic, Zulu, Icelandic, Swedish, Italian, Mandarin, Urdu, Hindi, French, Spanish, all in various different stages. This is an unfunded project, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank all the wonderful social scientists around the world who are doing these translations for free and recruiting into this survey for free. And I'm going to tell you about the preliminary results from the English-speaking respondents today. We've only just started analysing the data. I haven't even managed to get it out widely to the participant values task team yet, but it's all happening, it's all very new, and we're going to be analysing this moving forward. So for the English-speaking participants, we used a market research company to recruit because we wanted to get a representative sample, public samples. So we used a company called Research Now, which is like Ipsos Mori. And we've checked the data that we've got with census data and population data, and we know that these are representative public samples. So we've got samples from the UK, USA, Canada, and Australia, and here are the figures. So we've got just under 10,000. There are subtle differences between the different demographic groups, and we've adjusted for those in all the modelling that we've done. But actually, broadly speaking, there isn't a difference in attitudes between these 4 countries, which is absolutely fascinating. So I'm actually going to pull together all the English-speaking data and present it as one. So one of the first questions in the survey was about familiarity with DNA genetics and genomics. So here's the question. Are you familiar with DNA genetics and genomics? And just under half of the sample said no. And those who said yes get their reference to this whole industry through either their work as a teacher or as a nurse, through their personal interests, so perhaps having ancestry testing or maybe being part of a biobank research, or through their medical history, their personal family history of something. What was also really notable was that people also said that they got their familiarity with genetics from popular culture, from the media, from TV programs, from CSI, from the pseudoscience that we absorb by just being in society. And that's actually incredibly important and is highly likely to be influencing some of the attitudes that we're seeing, and I'll come back to that later. Another early question in the questionnaire is DNA information different to other sorts of medical information, like a cholesterol reading or an X-ray? And often we feel in the genomics world that genomics data is exceptional in some way, and I've not actually seen in any surveys asking patients or public if they think it's different to medical data. So this is the question. Is DNA information different to other sorts of medical information? And we found just over half of people said, yes, it's different. So why are they saying that? They're saying things like, it's special because it links us to our relatives. It's special because it can tell me about my past, present, and future health. It's different because I can pass it on to children. Now, just because they think it's different, does it mean they think it should be handled differently? Should it be given any sort of level of special status in the data sharing process? Well, the simple answer to that is no. So should DNA data be handled differently to other sorts of online data that we have about ourselves online? So here is the question. Which types of online data need the greatest level of protection against unauthorized use? And we found 61% said medical data needs the greatest level of protection. Slightly less said DNA information needs the greatest level of protection. Hardly anybody said holiday photos. need the greatest level of protection. But fascinating, most people said banking details need the greatest level of protection. They were able to articulate, I can see a real harm if my banking data is hacked. People could steal money from me. But they were not saying similar things when they were talking about medical information and DNA information. So that says to me that we don't need to be thinking of the equivalent, secure banking systems for the sharing and the storage of our data. I think it's good to be aiming for that, but the public are maybe not expecting that. So would you donate your data? What do you think about your data being used in this research endeavour? So here's the question. Would you donate your anonymous DNA and or medical information for use by medical doctors, non-profit researchers and for-profit researchers? And we explained how they might use your data. And just over half said yes, they were happy for medical doctors to use their data. Slightly less said yes for non-profit researchers, and less, again, for the for-profit industry using their data. Now, this isn't a new finding. This has been replicated in many other studies, and it really speaks volumes to the idea of the pharma industry doing some really major PR campaigns about the value of data sharing and the use of data in our collective endeavour to improve human health. So there was definitely concern about pharma making profits from free donation. This came up particularly from the American participants. Why should I donate my data and yet others make money from it? What was also really striking was that those people who were the most willing to donate their data were the most familiar with the topic of genomics. And the most familiar with genomics were the patients. And the patients were actually the most likely to say, go use my data. I really don't mind if you identify me. I would accept a very high risk of being identified because I acknowledge that using my data is a good thing and I want you to go and do great things with it. So what's the profile of people who say they were willing to donate their data for use by others and for it to be shared? Well, they tended to be very familiar with the concepts of DNA genetics and genomics. They were also more likely to think DNA is different to the sorts of medical data. They were more comfortable donating if they knew there was legal protection in place. They were also more interested in receiving something back in return, like a DNA readout. That really means raw sequence data or return of results. They were also the most comfortable about handing over their data and allowing some responsible person, so whether that was an ethics committee or a custodian, deciding on their behalf what could happen to that data. So they were quite a chilled bunch. They were informed, they were happy to engage, they were happy for you to go and use their data. The profile of those who said they didn't want to donate their data were the most likely to be completely unfamiliar with what any of this is about. They didn't particularly think that DNA was special or different to other sorts of data. They weren't influenced by the knowledge of legal protections being in place for them. They had no opinion on having anything back in return. And they had no opinion on a custodian or a research ethics committee deciding on their behalf what would happen to their data. So basically the bottom line is they just were completely unaware of what any of this was about. What was also really significant is that there's no difference in any of the socio-demographic variables between those who wanted to donate and those who didn't. So it's not as if the donors were more educated or of a particular gender or of a particular age. There was actually no difference in any of the socio-demographics between those who were willing to donate and those who weren't. The only difference between the two groups was familiarity with this work. And also there was no difference in the perceived fears. I'll explain the data on the fears in a minute. But we asked people, if we linked your data, your online data with your personally identifiable data, what harms could happen? And people were able to articulate their fears, but there was no difference between those who would donate and those who wouldn't donate and their perceived fears. So basically people are not donating because they're frightened. That's not what we've seen. And we've found that people who are donating are able to articulate the fears, but it doesn't actually matter to them. They're just aware of what the potential risks are, and they're still willing to donate. So what are the perceived harms? So we said, if someone linked your DNA information to your name, your address, and your phone number, do you think you could be harmed in any way from this? And we asked people to rank their concerns. So the number 3 concerns was being targeted for inappropriate marketing. The second biggest concern was insurance discrimination. This always comes up in any surveys about genetics. But the number 1 potential harm that people were concerned about was my DNA being copied and then planted at the scene of a crime. Now, if you think programs like CSI have somewhere between 30 to 50 million viewers per episode, and that's just in the US, never mind worldwide, you can see if this is the way people are gaining knowledge, pseudo-knowledge about genetics via a process of osmosis with popular culture, it completely makes sense that this might be in your mind when you're thinking about potential harms from being identified together with your DNA information. And, you know, learning of this concern means it's actually something that we can address quite clearly, easily, with some good information to, you know, clear up misunderstandings about this. Now, interestingly, before I started working on this project, I was running a project called Socializing the Genome, which is where we were looking to create evidence-based public engagement materials about different things to do with genetics. And one of the films that we created was looking at the idea of conspiracy theories that people have about genetics and whether we could use those as a sort of conversation starter and allow people to engage with genetics through the conspiracy theories. And serendipitously, one of the films we created really speaks to this. So if we were thinking about creating public engagement materials to address this kind of concern, it might look something like this, which I'm just going to show you.
Your DNA, amazing, packed with rich, intimate information about you, which is why you're not sharing it with anyone, right? Because in our data-filled, joined-up world, it might get stuck together with all your other precious data, right? And you can't trust who'll get their hands on that, right? Well, not quite. To be clear, the only thing someone dodgy looking at your anonymous DNA sequence will see is this. And speaking of dodgy, let's take a closer look at some of the fantastical bogeymen out there. The weird scientist, dodgy corporation, and the criminal mastermind. Well, the scientists would be caught pretty quick, lose their job, and probably spend time in jail if they even thought of stealing your DNA. If a dodgy corporation tried to use your DNA data to cold call you or discriminate against you, they'd be breaking the law. And as for planting your DNA at a crime scene, all we'd say is, don't believe everything you see on CSI. So, what might your DNA spell for you?
So this is very culturally British, and I'd always say that if you're wanting to create public engagement materials, always tailor-make them to your audience so that they culturally fit. So the key messages from this research, those unwilling to donate their data are basically totally unfamiliar with what any of this is about. So that really speaks to doing public engagement and putting out education programs and actually bringing people up to speed with some of this. Those most in favour of donating are patients. They are the most altruistic. They're prepared to accept a high level of being identified. They feel the act of donating and use of their data outweighs the risks. The public can articulate the harms of identification, and this does not seem to affect their willingness to donate. We should be explicit about what the risks are, and this data is saying it won't put people off, it just means they're better informed. They can weigh up the pros and cons. The public are more worried about banking data being hacked than genomic data. And popular culture influences our views about genomics. And so I would, thinking about moving forward, I think we should be using popular culture as a springboard for starting conversations. It's a big, big audience out there that we can tackle and reach through popular culture. It's pivotal to collect patient and public attitudes, and all of our data will be freely available online so that you can all scrutinise it. It'll be there for social sciences data to be shared. It's pivotal to do this so that policy, particularly made by the Global Alliance, has a public voice in it. It also means that we can target and inform our engagement and education activities. But the most important reason for actually collecting this data is really so that we as a society are guiding the application of the technology rather than the other way round. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Oh, there's already people with questions. Great. I think give them a chance to sit down, and you're first.
Yeah, Mark Williams, Geisinger. This is actually a brief speech guised as a question. This was related to Anna, and I just wanted to reflect that it was very interesting to see those results because it reflects almost exactly what we saw when we did our extensive community engagement with our Geisinger members to inform our MyCode Community Health Initiative. We were concerned that what we were seeing was perhaps a local phenomena because we've been embedded with that community for a century, and so we had very high levels of trust. But as we've now extended that into a different area where we haven't had a presence, specifically Atlantic City, which you might suspect looks slightly different than central Pennsylvania, we are seeing exactly the same results, which are very concordant with yours. So again, I think that this really reflects the idea that we need to be informed by those folks as opposed to a bunch of smart people that can think up doomsday scenarios sitting around a table and let that drive policy.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any comment, Anna? You're right?
Nothing really, other than I totally agree with what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, what's so lovely about doing a broad public survey is that you reach people that often don't take part in this sort of research. And with such a broad education background and socio-demographic background, and including all the really hard to reach people that don't normally take part in surveys as well, it's fantastic to see that there's no surprises really out there.
Other questions? Yes.
It's for David. What has changed with the prior sensitive data regulation and with the new regulation?
That's a nice question. I would say not as much as one might have thought. The directive, I could have put a similar sort of graphic up with the for the directive as for the regulation. Just the numbers have shifted around a bit. The degree of protection is very much the same. I think the additions are things like the risk assessment. The sanctions are much stronger. That's absolutely the case. But I actually think for research, the opportunities are slightly better than they were under the directive. But I think, in a sense, it's more of the same, which perhaps reflects the way it took so long to get to onto the statute book. It took 4 years of hard negotiation, and I think over the time it just came back towards what was already there. So I don't think it's much change, actually. It's perhaps then we didn't take the opportunities that were there for us under the directive, actually.
Yeah, maybe. Just a quick question for Jennifer before we go back to the mics. We were talking about popular culture and having co-chaired the health data governance. Without naming cultures, could you see in the endless revision of all those recommendations and mechanisms and so on, more cautious approaches, or did the attitudes of the different countries and so on that were there present reflect the absence or presence of healthcare systems or a suspicion of DNA? What were your overall observations on some of the cultural influences in the debate?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As I mentioned, this was a rather innovative action by the OECD because it had literally in one part of the OECD the folks who worked on data protection and security. And these tended to be heavily dominated by lawyers and IT people. Another part of the OECD with another committee, they worked on various health issues, and these tended to be people, health professionals, and people who were really concerned about individuals and populations. So the marriage of those two attitudes, I guess, those two worldviews and experiences took a long time, which is why the committee started working in 2014, and we had some 40 experts named by all the various countries, and we went through rounds of discussion. And there you would see some would be patients' advocates, some would be very, very orthodox, silo approach to data, very, very worried that this was just the beginning of the end in a very loosey-goosey approach to privacy. And I don't know that those particular voices have been reconciled, but what is interesting, I think, is that the Privacy and Security Committee realized that it had to put a bit of water in its wine, so to speak, because a big driver for the OECD is the cost of healthcare in all its countries. And, you know, it realized that it had to, I guess, be more flexible in working to a real-life application of privacy and security principles. But a lot of those tensions still exist, and that's why I think the OECD work on implementing them is so important, because in your own countries you have to work around these persisting attitudes.
Thank you. We'll take the two questions together. So go ahead, please, and after that we'll take our break.
Okay. This is for Anna. With regards to the attitudes for-profit uses, I noticed that it was labeled as big pharma, and could that be attitudes towards big pharma, which we know is not always good, or was there more nuance in that other for-profit companies include software developers, for instance Google, and other uses such as that don't elicit that negative response?
Next question, then we'll take them. Go ahead.
So it's great to hear the GDPR being presented as an opportunity rather than the problem, and that the GA4GH is involved with that. But what can you as individuals or institutions do to gain benefit?
Thank you. All right, Anna, you're on, and then David.
So we did describe the difference between medical doctors, non-profit researchers, and for-profit researchers, and we were very careful to articulate that for each of those groups, people still benefit. So even the non-profit researchers may get increase in grants or funding or publications or recognition by having access to data and data sharing. And you know, and the same for clinicians who get recognition for getting a diagnosis right because they've accessed data. So it's not as if these other groups are neutral. People are benefiting all round. We did also describe so Big Pharma was just a sort of a summary way that we used in the films to describe the for-profit industry. But in the glossary terms that you could access when you hover your mouse over the term, you can get more of an extensive description of what the for-profit industry could be described as. But I totally acknowledge, yes, it could well be biasing towards a particularly negative view.
David?
Well, I think that the way that we can have an impact here is because the Article 40 Code of Conduct is an invitation from the bottom up, really. It's from different sectors to provide the granularity of how this general data protection regulation, which is supposed to cover everything, actually works in your area. And so the first thing is we can make sure that we've got a robust and sensible version for our area. And I think we've hopefully showed some of those ways that can work. And how we can feed into the discussion at the BVMRI, feed into the drafting, make sure that what goes to the Commission as a sensible code of conduct would work. And then I think the other part of it is the public opinion stuff. I think that's really lacking at the moment because there's also that fear in amongst the regulators, in amongst the supervisory authorities, in amongst the courts, that somehow if we take a lighter line on this, or we open up a more pro-data sharing, pro-genomic work line, somehow the great public will be against this. But I think this information now, this evidence shows that this isn't the case. I mean, I'm interested in how you deal with the range of sensitivities that this shows. It's not, you know, if there's 46%, there's also 54%. So how we manage that is really important. But this is the bedrock for actually making a big impact in not just regulation, but in governance.
Thank you. Folks, I have to tell you, you only have a 15-minute coffee break as we want to end on time, but I think in spite of that, we can still thank our speakers.